Hello. My sewing machine came in the mail 3 days ago, but a bitch has been feeling so sick that I have not taken the time to put the sewing machine together. So, actually, I don't think you have to put it together. I think it comes put together. So I'm gonna take it out of the box and we're gonna do something with it. Okay. Wow. The sewing machine that I did procure with my adult money is the Brother Thick and Juicy, the Brother Strong and Tough sewing machine. So we're gonna see how strong and how tough she in fact is. Okay, look at her. Look at her. I think I'm just gonna try and sew something and I'll let you guys know how it goes. Okay, hey, voice over me checking in. So I started off by cutting out the pattern, which is step one. It took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to figure out how to lay all of these pages out. Every pattern does it a little bit differently, but once I figured out the knack to it, it came pretty easily. This pattern has some interfacing around the shoulders, but I knew that since the fabric that I'm working with is a little bit thicker, I didn't really think that that was necessary. So I just cut that part of the pattern off and then set it aside. The front panel was cut by folding like the fabric in half and then cutting like the fold line. So I was trying to kind of arrange my curtain so that I would be able to use as much of the fabric as possible and like waste as little as possible. I am cutting on my floor, which I'm sure I'll get a few comments of people yelling at me and saying that that's a terrible idea. But I did look several times and I seriously didn't make a single mark on this floor. The floors in this house are really old, and I'm sure you can probably tell from the video that they have seen better days. So you honestly can't even see any cut lines. So I wasn't too worried about it. I did discover later in working in this pattern that this particular fabric actually cuts a lot better with fabric scissors. So when I started the shorts, I ended up using that instead, and it was so much easier. So here I am just cutting out the back panel. The back panels are cut in two, and then there's like a seam down the middle, which I think is a really cute kind of like detail, I guess, since the top overall is pretty basic. Honestly, I feel like cutting out the fabric was actually super easy and was probably the easiest part of this project. I started off by just trying to sew the shoulder seams, and this was kind of my first attempt. I did do a little bit of sewing with like an old ratty t-shirt, so I did get like a little bit of practice in, but I got so frustrated immediately trying to hold these pieces of fabric in place because I am putting the two velvet sides together. It was just slip sliding all over the place and I was getting so upset. So I ended up sewing the two shoulder seams here, and then I actually just kind of like put everything away for the night and just gave it a break. And the following day, I actually went to Michael's and got some pins because I was convinced that this type of fabric would be easier to pin than to use the clips that I had gotten. But honestly, spoiler alert, the pins also didn't really work very well. This is just a really difficult fabric to work with, and I'm sure that there are some like tips and tricks if you are a pro, which obviously I am not. So I had a really hard time with it. This is what I ended up with at the end of this little sewing session. It honestly doesn't look too bad. Like, considering this is my first attempt ever, I feel like it doesn't look terrible. A couple days later, I finally worked up the nerve to get started on this project again. I honestly got so frustrated my first night that I had to take a few days off. I decided to move to the dining room as well because I just really needed a bigger table to work on, and my desk is not doing it. The desk is definitely a more aesthetic workspace, like in terms of, you guys being able to watch like an aesthetic video. But honestly, I was so frustrated with this that it was more like, I don't know. I just wanted to get it done. And if that meant the video was less aesthetic, then I was willing to sacrifice that. So I hope that it doesn't make this like too bad for you guys watching. But yeah, anyway, I have my little makeshift sewing area in the dining room, which is honestly, it's working for me. I ended up seam ripping the two shoulder seams that I sewed in the first clip. And then this is me trying to use some pins and sew them a second time. And I will say, I feel like sewing them again, they actually turned out like almost exactly the same as they did before, which is really funny. And the pins made virtually no difference in how the fabric kind of held together. So I ended up quickly putting those aside and going back to the clips because the clips are honestly just so much easier to use, and then I don't have to worry about stabbing my finger. So yeah, you can kind of see how that seam was looking. I feel like it was at this point in the project that I knew this was going to turn out very wonky, and I just kind of resigned myself to learning and just kind of being comfortable with making a lot of mistakes and it being really imperfect. And I feel like once I did that, it made the process a lot less irritating. I was so obsessed with like having this be something that I'm going to wear in the end. And I very quickly realized that that probably was not going to be possible. So I don't know if that will help anybody else who is starting out to kind of have that mindset going into it, but it definitely helped me because I can have some pretty intense perfectionist tendencies and it makes it really hard to learn new hobbies or try new things sometimes. So, yeah, that definitely helped a lot. But here I am just starting to sew the side seams of the shirt. And I didn't really worry too much about like, I don't have a serger, but like, I don't know what the word would be, like serging the two seams together so that they don't fray. Because this isn't something that I'm probably going to get a lot of wear of, I honestly didn't really worry about that. Also, because of the type of fabric that this is, I noticed that the fraying just really didn't impact this fabric as much as like maybe other fabrics would. So yeah, I didn't really worry about that too much. Definitely know that there are a ton of tips and tricks if you are getting into sewing and you don't want to buy both a sewing machine and a serger, or maybe you don't even know what a serger is yet. So I'm probably not going to buy one for years and years and years because I'll probably use some of the other techniques to avoid having to do that. But yeah, who knows? Maybe in like 5 years, if I'm still sewing up a storm, I feel like that might be a worthwhile investment. But at this point, I feel like that is way too much. I am just sewing up the other side seam. As you can see, at this point, I'm still using the pins and they were honestly ruining my life. I feel like there is a time and place where having pins is super, super helpful, but I am just so glad that clips are a thing now because they are so much easier to use. And I'm honestly like really stressed at the thought of dropping a pin on the floor and one of my animals eating it or something horrific like that or stepping on it. So I feel like using the clips is just so much better and safer. So I will definitely probably be using those more than you will see me use the pins in the future, but I definitely think they're handy and kind of nice to have around. As I got to the end of this seam though, I started getting really upset because the fabric had shifted so much that like they were no longer lining up well. So I didn't film this part, but I did end up actually seam ripping one of the sides and then redoing it because I just really could not stand the way the fabric wasn't lining up. At this point, I had delayed whipping out the iron as long as I possibly could. And so I went through and ironed flat some of those seams that I had sewed earlier. This was where I made my first mistake with the shirt, though. When I went back in to do the seams for the armholes and for the bottom, I didn't pay attention to the seams laying flat when I sewed them. So on one of the seams, I did it perfectly, and on the other seam, I accidentally like sewed the top flat and then the bottom with it all pulled to one side. So I ended up with this like very weird kind of like roll in my shirt, which is like not a huge deal. Like you can't really tell when it's on. But it's just one of those beginner mistakes that I feel like for the future shirts that I make, I will definitely pay closer attention to that because it makes the final piece just that much nicer, I think. At this point, I am getting started at hemming up the bottom of the shirt and the two armholes. And yeah, this part was actually pretty tricky. I was trying to work with a pretty small seam allowance and I kept having the fabric slip slide all over, and I was really trying to like experiment with different ways of feeding the fabric through the machine. So you can see me like moving my arms around a lot And since making this video, I've watched quite a few other sewing videos, and something that I've observed, like watching people who are obviously much better at sewing than me, is it seems like when they're working with trickier fabrics, it seems better to maybe go slower. I think I was almost trying to like rush through, not to get it over with, but almost just to like maybe if I go fast, the fabric will stay in place better, but I actually think it's the other way around. So I really need to practice like being a little bit more steady with my pressure on the pedal. I shifted gears to the shorts. I'm kind of doing like a grand reveal at the end where I'll try on the entire fit and show you guys how it turns out. So I'm so sorry to leave you in suspense, but I'm gonna make you wait. Here I am just measuring the pattern, and then I measured my own hip width because I felt really concerned that the shorts were going to be either too small or way too big. And I kind of just want like that perfect oversized, but not too oversized kind of fit. So I did one last double checking, and then for this one, I actually decided to cut the pattern out with scissors and then place the cutout pattern on top of the fabric, which I didn't really do, I don't think, the first time. Like I just didn't worry too much about it being too like perfect, but I actually feel like this did make a really big difference in the end. It made it so much easier to cut out, and then when I was cutting it out, instead of using the rotary cutter, I decided to use scissors, and that made the biggest difference. This fabric was just difficult to work with in every sense of the word, and I didn't even really want to cut well, but doing it with scissors gave me so much more control. For the shorts pattern, I ended up having to cut out 2 front panels and 2 back panels, so that's what I'm doing here. I did make a little mistake when I cut things out. I actually ended up cutting out my back panel like 3 inches too big on the top, and so you'll see that like weird extra fabric throughout this like section of the video, and I do end up cutting that off at the very end because it was super unnecessary. I don't know, maybe there was a purpose for it in the pattern and I'm just like not really sure what that was. But yeah, I did end up cutting it off. So don't be alarmed when you see that here in the beginning of the video. There might have been a part of the like pattern that I was supposed to have cut off at the beginning, but I don't know. I genuinely don't know what happened, but it turns out okay in the end, spoiler alert. So I'm not too worried about it. But here are my finished front panels, and then I'm just putting them together, and I went ahead and sewed the side seams on either side. I honestly kind of went a little bit rogue when I was doing the shorts because I thought that I don't know, I think I just got a little bit too big for my britches here, so to speak. And I really thought that I could do this without looking at the pattern too much. And that was a huge, huge mistake. I ended up sewing the middle seam completely wrong, and I ended up having to seam rip the entire thing and then go back. And I was so frustrated and so angry. But in the end, I followed the pattern and I managed to get those pieces together, and that was so exciting. I did try on the shorts before I had done the hem or the elastic just to make sure in their like rawest form that they did fit, and I ended up with so much extra room to mess around with in terms of doing the hem and doing the top elastic, which honestly at this point, because I'm such a beginner, I would much rather work with too much fabric than not enough. So I was really happy with that. They looked so silly on though, you guys. But here is me just sewing the elastic waistband. I made my second, third, fourth mistake here, and I actually closed up the elastic little space, and you're supposed to leave like a little hole so that you can feed the elastic through. So I ended up having to seam rip the little hole, and then I actually used a chopstick to feed the elastic through the waistband. I just kind of like taped the elastic to the chopstick, and it worked brilliantly. Like it made it so much easier. But for this last little bit, I am just measuring out the hem for the bottom of the shorts, and then we are pretty much done with this project, and I'm so excited for you guys to see the finished result. Okay, it's time for the final reveal. I have a lot of things to say. I actually took some notes on all of my thoughts from this project, but before we get into all of that, I just wanted to show you guys how it turned out. So, This is her. I did go ahead and put some shoes on, my Doc Martin Mary Janes. Um, Honestly, I made it. Is it perfect? No. Will I ever wear it out of the house? Also, probably no. But I did make it. I'm very proud of it. I think that considering it is my first project, I think it turned out very cute. But yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So let's talk about it. I figured we would do our little debrief on the living room floor because that is just the vibe. I kind of blend in with the couch, which is really funny. But as promised, I did take some notes on my thoughts having finished my very first ever sewing project. I should have maybe disclaimed this at the beginning of the video, but I did do a little bit of sewing when I was a middle schooler. So I did go into this knowing the basics of like how generally to like thread a bobbin, thread the needle, all of that stuff. But that being said, like, I don't think any of those things are super difficult, and they're all slightly different on every machine. So I definitely don't think that that should discourage anyone from getting into sewing if it's something that you're interested in doing. Anyway, here are the thoughts that I wrote down. I think it's so rewarding to make your own clothes. And even if it didn't turn out perfectly, it just feels so amazing to be able to make something that is functional, that I can use all of the time. And I just feel like there's such a sense of accomplishment with learning something new and like actually making something that you can use. And honestly, I just don't think that that feeling can really be replicated with like many other things. So I think even if it doesn't turn out perfect, like just that little dopamine boost, that little reward of having made something is enough, I think, for me. Okay, next thoughts. Get a tried and true pattern. So I kind of went more of an inexpensive route, and I went with some like $2 and $3 patterns from Etsy. And there's really nothing wrong with doing that. But I noticed in my pattern search that there's a lot of things on Etsy that look like they're AI, and they just don't always seem like they're patterns that have been tested very much. So I would definitely seek out, there are a lot of free patterns as well from designers that are well known and that actually like test their patterns. So you know that what you're getting is something that has been tested on multiple body types and multiple sizes, etc., and has been kind of fleshed out a little bit, because I definitely do think that that makes a huge difference with how your piece fits in the very end. And that doesn't mean that you have to go spend a ton of money on a super expensive pattern, but just pick one that has been tested, because I definitely do think that it makes a really big difference. This is fairly obvious, but maybe not so much in my case. Pick a beginner fabric. I just went with what I had handy. I had some extra curtains around the house, and I just didn't really want to spend a ton of money on fabric to start off with when I figured I just had things kind of lying around. And I definitely do regret doing that because it created a lot of issues for me trying to work with a fabric that like moves all around and just is not very beginner friendly. In hindsight, I definitely do think that this is going to make my next project feel much easier in comparison to working with velvet. But I think just to save yourself a bunch of irritation, just work with a beginner fabric. As with like any other type of hobby, go into this expecting to make lots of mistakes and go into it with the idea that you might not actually wear your first piece, which I feel like is maybe also fairly obvious. But if you're like me, I tend to just expect to be a professional my very first time trying something, and it's really hard for me sometimes to push through the imperfections and just kind of enjoy, the trials and tribulations that come along with learning something new. So I definitely think just going into it expecting for whatever you make to be something that you're either not going to wear or not going to use, and that you're going to make a lot of mistakes, just kind of sets your brain up to sort of expect that. And then if you end up with a wearable or something that you're going to use at the end, then that's amazing. That's even more exciting. But at least you're kind of like, I don't know, managing your expectations, I guess. When I was thinking about sewing, I watched so many YouTube videos of other people who were sewing for the first time, and all of their things turned out so well and they looked so perfect. And now that I've gotten started, I definitely wonder how like genuine and honest those are. And this is like no shade whatsoever. I just feel like it is super, super unrealistic to expect your first project to turn out beautiful and like something that you're gonna wear all the time. But I think that's everything that I had to say about this first project. project. I really hope you guys enjoyed this behind the scenes. I've actually already purchased my fabric for my second project, so if you guys would be interested in seeing a follow-up sewing video, definitely let me know. But if you made it this long, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you very soon in the next one.